Hey crypto world, it's Joe here from BitAML. Excited to be with all of you to discuss the state of crypto regulation in 2020. For those that I've not met, it's a pleasure to meet you. By way of background, I am the founder of BitAML, a regulatory compliance advisory firm founded to serve exclusively the cryptocurrency space back in 2015. Someone had mentioned that that makes me an OG in cryptocurrency. I'm pretty sure that was a compliment, but I've enjoyed the 5+ years that I've spent in that space. I'm also the co-founder of ComplyFit, which is a technology company we spun out of BitAML to help serve the crypto community with various different pieces of technology to help with compliance efforts. In addition to my crypto compliance background, I have 10 years of bank compliance experience working for legacy banks. I am a proud legacy bank defector, now enjoying my time in the cryptocurrency space, and I am a devout cryptocurrency enthusiast. So I'm really excited to talk to you about what's going on in cryptocurrency today and where things are going in 2020. But first, I think we need to cover some of the existing regulations. Just a quick overview. I know for some of you very experienced in the space, you've heard about AML and KYC and FinCEN and regulators, and that's great. So maybe it's a little bit of a refresher for some of those that are more senior in our audience. But as well, I think it really gives us some great context. If we're going to talk about what's going on in 2020, we need to have a little bit of that background. So perhaps a primer for some of you, but hopefully this is something that we can make sure that everybody is on the same page and has an appreciation for the regulatory compliance efforts in place. There's a bit of a myth, by the way, that crypto is unregulated. Far from it. There are a lot of regulatory agencies, a veritable alphabet soup, if you will, of agencies that have weighed in various measure with respect to crypto businesses, and you can see some of them here on our slide. What federal regulation comes down to is if you are a quote-unquote financial institution as defined by the Bank Secrecy Act. So the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970, which by the way is maybe the most Orwellian name one could come up with, it's far from secretive. This was about banks sharing information with the government, so it's a bit of a misnomer. But in any case, Bank Secrecy Act of 1970, in that the government defined financial institutions as having to participate in the process of instituting an anti-money laundering or AML program and sending certain mandatory reports to government. So again, no dictionary definition of financial institution, but rather it's an itemized list of different types of business models. Now, some of those business models we know of, such as a money transmitter, right? So FinCEN back in 2013, which seems like 100 years in Bitcoin years, was the first formal regulatory agency to weigh in at the federal level as it pertained to cryptocurrency, saying that if you provided for the exchange of cryptocurrency, whether that's fiat to crypto, crypto to fiat, or crypto to crypto, you'd be considered a money transmitter. A money transmitter is a type of financial institution under the Bank Secrecy Act. Moving on, the IRS has said in certain circumstances for purposes of taxation that cryptocurrency is considered property. Capital gains, capital loss. Nearly every transaction in cryptocurrency is going to have some sort of gain or loss and is arguably a taxable event. Very important to keep those tax records. Other regulatory agencies at the federal level of note, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, or CFTC, has said in certain circumstances cryptocurrency could be considered a commodity and would be regulated as such. Similarly, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, has said under certain circumstances cryptocurrency would be treated as a security. What it comes down to, bottom line, are the facts and circumstances of your business. That'll determine how you're regulated and who regulates you. But if you have any question about where things are in terms of your business model, take a look at the Bank Secrecy Act. That's where all of this starts off with. So you may not necessarily have a specific agency that you think of when you think of your business model, but if it falls under the Bank Secrecy Act, you are likely to have have in place a written AML compliance program and submit mandatory filings. And as such, you would most likely fall under FinCEN as a non-bank financial institution. Now, the state level is a little bit different, and it's going to be very difficult for us to cover all 50 states and the territories of the United States. But what we've done is divided into 3 buckets in terms of state regulation. There's favorable and unfavorable as the bookends on left and right. Now, if you're favorable or unfavorable, That means what they have in common, that means that the states have actually weighed in. There's something official. It's on official government letterhead. You can print it out and put it on your wall. There is some sort of regulatory stance. Unfavorable, classic example, the bit license, right? We would say that's unfavorable. And again, unfavorable and favorable in the eyes of the crypto community. So it has it in writing. On the favorable side, we'll have states like Texas, which has Memorandum 1037, or Illinois, for example, which has guidance from the IDFPR. In the case of both of those states, have put down the terms under which a license is required, and conversely, what exceptions may apply based on your business model and to not have a state license. So those are more straightforward and as close to black and white as you can get for a regulatory compliance situation. That wide swath of land in the middle, the unsettled area of state regulation, is very interesting. There are several states, and I would say probably still a majority of the states, have a so-called unsettled, or what we've often termed as or no opinion status, meaning the states have not necessarily put anything in formal writing one way or the other. That is up to the actual crypto business to contact the state and find out where they may lie in terms of a regulatory determination. And so those can be more difficult to have that information readily available. The so-called no action or no opinion status has been to the benefit of certain business models like Bitcoin ATMs, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So hopefully with that context, it gives you a little bit of a background on some of the regulations. Again, probably some repeat material for some of you that are more embedded in the community and have been involved in crypto for quite some time. But I think it really lays a good foundation for discussing what we're seeing here in 2020. Speaking of state licensing, one of the tenets of our findings for what we believe is going to happen in 2020 is we're going to see more states move away from the so-called no action or no opinion regulatory status and move towards formal licensing. To give you some examples, the state of New Jersey currently has legislation that would regulate institutions engaged in cryptocurrency-related activities at the state level. Now, obviously, there are a lot of legislative actions that are placed on hold with the COVID-19 pandemic that is going on right now. However, we do see that these pieces of legislation are at least have been introduced and will have the chance to move forward. So New Jersey is a great example of legislation that is going to be heard and potentially some action taken to remove the so-called no opinion or no action status and move towards formal licensing. State of California, much the same. They are contemplating a state licensing regime. Assembly Bill 2150, I believe, is the cadence to that. If you wanted to do some research, there have been some hearings that were held late last year here in California, and we suspect that's going to continue once the pandemic or the situation surrounding the pandemic has quieted down, and there'll be a return to business as close to normal as possible, and we'll see those actions as well. We've also heard that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has engaged a working group within its walls to discuss the potential for licensure or regulatory action with or without the help of the state legislature on Beacon Hill in Boston. So it's going to be interesting to see how those play out, and those are just the 3 states that we know of that have been a little bit more public about this. I'd imagine that there are several other states that are maybe quietly doing some research, or at a minimum, just surrounding themselves with some information and preparing to move in that direction. And we'll see this ramp up later this year, and I suspect well into 2021 and beyond as more states take affirmative stances. Next observation we have for 2020 is that consumer protection is going to become a key point of emphasis among regulators in the crypto space. Now, it's not to say that they haven't already thought about that, but if we look at the context of state licensing versus the federal level, federal regulators are more concerned with protecting the integrity of the financial system, looking for wide-scale money laundering, illicit groups, organized criminal activities, and maintain that as a point of emphasis. Now, of course, they care about consumer protection, and we've seen that as part of their regulatory examination process, but the point of emphasis for consumer protection is much more on the states. Historically, states have looked at regulation within financial services with a lens on consumer protection. And it would serve to reason that as we get more states going down the rabbit hole of licensing and away from no action, that we're going to see this come to light. Compounding that in some of the information that we've been reviewing with respect to mention New Jersey and California moving towards licensing, in some of the press releases and information that has surrounded the proposed legislation in New Jersey, there have been a lot of pieces of information and indications from those that have authored the bill and those that are championing this piece of legislation that consumer protection is a main focus. Interestingly enough, California has taken that a step further. Governor Newsom has proposed through legislative or through the budgetary action that he will increase or proposes to increase the budget for what is now called the Department of Business Oversight, which regulates money transmitters and other businesses across California, that he will add budgetary funds and other resources so that that function can grow out and be more interactive with innovations in financial services, whether that's fintech or crypto, and has in that budget more to bring on additional personnel. So it's going to be very interesting to see where that goes. And as part of that package, interestingly enough, the governor here in California has touted that he wants to make it a point of emphasis on protecting consumers and vulnerable populations, that they have access to the same information and the same resources and can make the same decisions about financial services. He wasn't speaking specifically about crypto, but when we're talking about innovations in financial services, I think we can all agree that crypto is definitely part of that conversation. A bit more timely here in 2020, we believe that regulators are not in any way going to tolerate or excuse compliance oversights as a result of COVID-19. We would never suspect that to begin with. Regulators tend to be quite monotone in terms of the rules always applying and not having any exceptions. And this is certainly no exception to that potential exception. Interestingly enough, in March, middle of March, FinCEN, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, news bulletin in which they warned financial institutions across the board about potential scams involving COVID-19. Scams associated with grants, awards, even the purchases of medical equipment, device, or other supporting pieces of information or anything like that related to COVID-19 that the scam artists and illicit actors might take advantage and commit fraud against a weary public. In that same news release, FinCEN stated that if financial institutions have any concerns whatsoever about meeting their mandatory filing deadlines or not being able to submit reports in accordance with thresholds or deadlines or anything like that, to let FinCEN know right away. And at first I looked at that and I said, oh, they're showing some accommodations. They want to have that outreach. And I believe that that is indeed true. But what also occurred to me is this is perhaps a stamp that FinCEN is putting out there to say, hey, look, we reached out to you and we let you know that if you had any questions or you had any needs and you were concerned about meeting a deadline, that you ought to contact us. So don't for one second think that you can use COVID-19 as a crutch to later on say, well, we were overwhelmed and we didn't have these things and this was over here and that was over there and we had to meet payroll. FinCEN has said, look, if you're having any troubles, you need to contact us. And indeed, you must do that right away. And I suspect, and if we've advised our clients, it's business as usual with compliance. Get the work done, treat everything as it would be in normal business, make sure your reports are submitted in a timely manner, early if possible, but thoroughly completed. And that in no way could this be used as any sort of excuse. And by the way, if you have yourself some extra time for whatever reason, I know it's very difficult to say that if transactions or volumes are down, or perhaps you have kiosks and some of them are located inside a business that's non-essential and is therefore closed to the public, and whatever reason you find yourself with some extra time, reinvest that time into reviewing your compliance programs. Are we behind on training? Do we need to take a look at our red flags and update some of those conditions and some of those thresholds? Take that time and take that extra bandwidth that you would normally have devoted to compliance in action, reviewing transactions. With volumes being in decline, take that opportunity, reinvest in yourself, and so when you do participate in examination and you do talk to regulators, you can demonstrate that using your extra time, you were able to invest that right back into your AML and other controls. Some other points of emphasis here in 2020, we see regulators and examiners continuing to apply pressure on exchanges and other platforms to delist or de-risk higher risk cryptocurrencies like zero knowledge or zero proof coins. So it's not really feasible to outlaw a particular coin, right? We know that that's probably not going to work, but we've seen that regulators through the examination process have really honed in on the fact that not all cryptos are created equal, that they all have different risks, they all have different underlying technology, that there are some elements of that cryptocurrency that are completely different. And so a crypto is a crypto is a crypto is not true. And in many cases, at least early on, exchanges were willing to list any coin, right? And the due diligence process was minimal at best. And through the process of examinations, now examiners are applying pressure to exchanges to demonstrate that they understand the risks of those individual coins. And with the demand for some of these coins, particularly some that have a larger privacy concentration or zero knowledge or zero proof, the interest level is fairly low. And at the same time, if that compliance burden is increased, now it becomes an easier equation for the exchange to say, well, we're no longer supporting this coin or that coin. So I think that's going to be interesting to see. And many of these exchanges, I believe, are going to start to delist or de-risk rather some of the more speculative coins. I think the first iteration of this was, okay, let's make sure we're not listing a security, which is very important, right? We don't want to run afoul of securities regulations, so you certainly don't want to list and in any way participate in an unlicensed security situation. The sort of 2.0 iteration of that is, okay, of these coins that we have, we're fairly certain that none of them are securities, but let's look at the underlying risk for regulation, for potential money laundering, or something like that, and really be able to define what that risk is and have appropriate controls. Interestingly enough, we think that there's going to be more pressure on banks as it pertains to cryptocurrency. And I know that may be a tendency for us to want to giggle here in the crypto space saying, well, it's about time, right? You know, we seem to bear the brunt of all this. But before you get too excited, it's interesting that the banks really, in some of the research done by some of the blockchain analytics companies, really don't have a complete grasp of how much crypto goes through their institution or how much their customers, that is, participate in the crypto ecosystem. So I believe it was CipherTrace, one of the blockchain analytics companies, did some analysis and determined that 100% of all banks in the US have some exposure to crypto, meaning some of their customers at some point at least did one or two transactions, whether it's purchasing some crypto from an exchange to have on their own or in some way engaged in the space. And so the typical reaction of the bank is, well, you know, we don't support crypto businesses or we're not involved in crypto. We don't allow that. And they sort of just dismiss it with that one or two quick statements like that, as if they won't come in here if we put up a sign. And we all know that's not true, right? People in the crypto space are constantly opening a bank for a bank that's actually going to allow them to transact, whether it's on the more retail side or actually owning a business and transacting through that bank. And so we feel that in time, the government is going to request that these banks start to do more analysis of who they're dealing with in the crypto space, how much exposure they have to crypto-related activities and transactions, even if it's not a bank account for a crypto company, but it is their customers that are transacting in Bitcoin. What is their exposure from a concentration risk or a treasury risk? And again, it's easy to get kind of excited and kind of giggle and say, oh, you know, this one's for the banks, you know, it's usually us that's under pressure. If you're the bank and now you see all this extra work, you have that negative association of that extra work and that extra reporting tied to crypto. And it may be a little bit more difficult to get those banks interested in participating and supporting opening accounts for crypto companies or in any way participating in the crypto ecosystem. So that might be one sort of negative byproduct of that should the government decide to put more emphasis and onus on these particular banks to report and be more mindful of their crypto-related activities. You know, this observation is interesting and it comes as a result of some recent conferences that I attended pre-COVID. Federal law enforcement, the last two presentations or last two events I participated in were giving presentations about their investigations in Homeland Security, which of course are always very interesting. And there are these great stories and undercover agents and surveillance and look at this guy with a bill counter in the front seat of his car. You know, great storylines, great engagement from the audience, especially among compliance professionals. They always love to see the results of maybe you know, SARs that were filed or interactions that their institution has had with law enforcement. Either way makes for a great story. But what I thought was pretty interesting about these two most recent presentations, one from a high-ranking official on the East Coast and one on the West Coast from the Department of Homeland Security, is they each, to paraphrase, said something along the lines of, cryptocurrency is just another method of moving money or just another way of storing money. And I thought it was particularly interesting. One of the officials from Homeland Security that presented had a series of tiles for all the different innovations within the financial services space, going back to maybe check writing or uh, Pony Express way back when, pulling all the way forward to cryptocurrency, and then just before that, prepaid cards. And his comments were, it seems like every time we have a new innovation, we're told that this is going to be where all the bad guys are going to populate and they're going to use these different methods to transact and launder money. And this is the end of the world and we can't investigate this and you'll never catch these guys. And he said, crypto was like that at the beginning, but to us, it's just another method of moving money. We're law enforcement. They're the bad guys. We're going to follow the money and we're going to catch them. And we don't care if they're doing it with checks, with prepaid cards, or with cryptocurrency. And you may think, well, why is that important? Now, I personally think it's refreshing, right? For all the naysayers out there and the hardliners in the crypto space, oh, the government's out to get us. Oh, law enforcement doesn't like crypto. And sure, maybe there are some folks in these different areas that don't like crypto. There's some that don't like cash or prepaid cards. But at the end of the day, if they're looking at it as saying, hey, we want to catch bad guys and we want to follow the money, but we don't care what that money is, that should show us that we're kind of getting closer to closing that education gap and really letting people know that participation in the crypto ecosystem is not an indication that someone is a bad guy or we should watch out for them. But rather, it's just another method of moving money. And whether that's from a Main Street audience or from law enforcement, it's good to see that it's now a focus on who is doing it and what the activity is rather than the innovation itself. One final item before we get to some closing thoughts. One of the things that occurred to us recently in conversation, it seems that regulators are getting more concerned about non-custodial wallets and other pieces of software where individuals can store cryptocurrency. So as we all know, you can go on the App Store, you can download any number of wallets. They're non-custodial, they're pieces of software. If the companies that developed the software wanted to, they couldn't find a way to steal your money. They're just releasing a wallet for you to use out into the wild. And so that's a great notion, and there's some great wallet services out there, and we don't have time to cover each, but certainly no shortage of different pieces of software and different wallets that you can use that are non-custodial. But in our conversations, it became clear that government and law enforcement are particularly concerned with these because there's no way for attribution to a particular customer or to a particular party. Now, of course, they're going to continue to do regulatory exams and continue to demand the best in terms of AML compliance out of existing exchanges, kiosk ATMs, trading platforms, peer-to-peer websites. But there's less of a concern now that they've actually been through exams and the government has some reasonable assurance that you're at least doing some KYC or some AML, that there's some way to attribute a transaction or a wallet address to a specific customer or to a specific piece of information. In other words, there's a trail of breadcrumbs for law enforcement to follow, but that's not the case with non-custodial wallets or other pieces of software. What comes of this, I don't know. I think that there's going to be more of a conversation about what this looks like and what maybe can be done about getting more information about these particular transactions that occur on these platforms. I don't know that government has a way directly to regulate a piece of software, and that may be concerning if they do go down that rabbit hole. So again, I'm not suggesting one way or the other, but I think there's going to be, as I mentioned, a conversation about this going forward, and we should keep our ears tuned to that. So in closing, again, these are my observations from what I see going on right now so far in 2020 and what is likely to continue into the second half of this calendar year. And this information is just a result of listening and talking to our clients, resources and other information that's readily available. We subscribe to getting news and information sent to us from regulatory agencies like FinCEN or even Google News. Do yourself a favor, set those up for your business, lock that in so that you get pings when there's some sort of press release or news release from FinCEN. I mentioned earlier on about the COVID-19 warnings about scams and concerns about late filings. The way we got that information was by signing up for the FinCEN newsletter, right? So do yourself a favor and put yourself out there where you can get that information. There's no secret society of crypto compliance professionals where we all get together and have these pieces of information. This is a result of getting out there, information gathering, being just as good of a listener as we are receiving that information and analyzing ourselves. And remember, with compliance, you always want to stay ahead of the curve. You want to know and see where the puck is going. Rather than reacting to what's out there. And it's a great way to stay ahead is to stay tuned in, have conversations with regulators, take that information that you find online, research it, analyze it, and ask good questions. And if we can be part of that question and answer that you may have, feel free to reach out to myself and our team. Best way to do that, joe@bitaml.com or joe@complyfit.com. Happy to reach out that way. Otherwise, take a look at our website, bitaml.com. We have a blog page. We put out lots of great content on there, ranging from timely articles, such as things about COVID-19 that I mentioned earlier, things about state licensing, all the way down to some of the nuts and bolts basics of KYC. So for those of you that are newcomers, or perhaps you're welcoming in new members of your team, or you know some friends of yours that may be getting involved with crypto for the first time, we'd love to be that resource. We'd love to answer questions, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks so much.